Running a learning business today requires attention to growing reach, generating revenue, and demonstrating real impact, all while navigating constant change and fierce competition for learners' time and money.
To help, we've curated a collection of free resources for learning business professionals. You'll find frameworks, briefings, and reports, webinars, and tools focused on strategy, portfolio design, pricing, marketing, and more, all created specifically for organizations that sell continuing education and professional development.
If you care about building a stronger, more sustainable learning business, visit leadinglearning.com/free resources.
That's leadinglearning.com/free resources for practical tools and strategic insight to help you grow your reach, revenue, and impact.
If you want to grow the reach, revenue, and impact of your learning business, you're in the right place. I'm Celisa Steele.
I'm Jeff Cobb, and this is the Leading Learning Podcast. Pricing is one of the most powerful levers a learning business has for revenue. Yet many organizations still rely on tradition, guesswork, or incremental adjustments when setting prices.
Our guest in this episode, number 475, is Dr. Michael Carr-Tatonetti, founder and CEO of Pricing for Associations and author of the book, Pricing for Associations. Michael specializes in helping associations develop pricing strategies grounded in data, value perception, and long-term sustainability.
In our conversation, Michael shares his approach to value-based pricing and explains how associations can use data, value analysis, and testing to make better pricing decisions.
You and Michael also talk about whether and how to bundle learning offerings with membership or create subscription-style offerings.
Yes, and Michael and I get into opportunities and risk, from protecting pricing power to making sure education's contribution to the organization's revenue and mission remains visible.
If you want practical insight into pricing strategy, subscriptions, and how education fits into a sustainable association business model, then stick around for this conversation with Dr. Michael Carr-Tatonetti.
You've been on the Leading Learning Podcast before, and we will most definitely link to that in the show notes and encourage folks to go listen to that. But for those who may not have listened to that episode or have listened to it recently, tell us a bit about your general perspective on pricing, your approach to pricing. When you're working with these organizations, kind of what's front of mind for you? What are you bringing to the table?
Yeah, so the big thing for me is I usually say, instead of throwing spaghetti at the wall of what's always been done, kind of taking a separate look at it. And the big thing for us is value-based pricing. So taking a look at what is the perception of your product or positioning in the market, and what is the willingness to pay of your audience for that value and perceived value. And it's not about greed for us. It's not about, oh, they're willing to pay, 3x more, let's charge 3x more. It's more of, are you already at the top of the market? Can you go up? If so, what's the strategic decision? Balancing mission and money. And so, yeah, that's kind of our high level, let's get some data behind it. Let's be a little bit methodical, look at the whole portfolio and make sure that it's making financial and business sense for the association.
So without asking you to give away your secret sauce, so to speak, how do you go about doing that? Because I'm sure listeners will be sitting here saying, well, that sounds great, but I don't know how our members and customers value us. I would love to know that.
Yeah. And, I'll always give it away. I don't care. So there's three big buckets to keep it high level. The first one's data. Usually what I like to look at there is satisfaction, metrics, surveys, all that. Second thing I look at in data is sales, and actually what have they purchased. Third is engagement or user behavior. So what I typically find is they'll say in a survey they want one thing, but then when we look at what they buy and what they utilize the most within what they buy, it might look different. And so we synthesize that together. The second big bucket's value analysis. So that's it. Associations already do that with all of their products. They're already doing member surveys, all that, post-event, et cetera. It's asking some key questions. Usually that's what we're bringing to the table, is a set of questions that you can embed into what you're already doing to start benchmarking value and pricing year over year. And then the third one is, once you've kind of done that benchmarking and seen where they want to go and looked at the data for what are they even doing, then it's figuring out, okay, if we reimagine this in one of these few ways, what's the willingness to pay? How does that adjust? And therefore, what's the best win-win for members in our audience? and the business and financial sustainability. So that's kind of the three: the data, value, and then price is our methodology.
Well, and where our worlds intersect is in education, is in learning. I mean, we do a lot of advising around pricing with our clients. I know you do a lot of advising to associations around how to price their education portfolios. I'd love to hear what you're seeing there. I'll say from our perspective, one thing I've started hearing in the last year, and this is the first time I'm really hearing it, and it's coming from CEOs, is some are wondering whether they should or can even be in the education business anymore because it's feeling so competitive out there. And pricing isn't the only issue, but pricing is an issue, definitely. They've got competitors who are underpricing them or putting free stuff into the marketplace, and they feel helpless in a way. I wonder, are you seeing any of that, or kind of what are you seeing in terms of pricing of education in the association world?
Yeah, that's fascinating. I'm seeing something similar, but what I haven't heard and what strikes me in what you just said was feeling like, should we tap out of education? Because inside, when you said that, my first response was, no, you shouldn't.
Right.
You should be in the education business. But what I am seeing alongside you is that market saturation of free or low cost, because that's what a lot of for-profits are doing. And then, with AI and all the things. So there is heavy competition, right? But what I'm seeing is education is typically the best product as far as profitability goes. Events, as we know, are very thin margins or at a loss. Membership, I don't know many associations that still have a real cost to serve down for membership to even know profitability. But education, and specifically digital, even some in-person, workshops and that. But education is the one area where I do see profitability. And when you look at the whole portfolio, they need that lift to help with like offsetting events and that. So that's crazy to me that that they're like, should we step out? Like, no. But it might be a matter of how does that look? And that's what we kind of talked about before our recording today, too, offline, was like, do we bundle into membership, or how do we imagine education? So I would alarmingly say, don't stop education, but maybe for some associations, it's how do we look at it? How are we delivering it? Right? Like, what's the packaging around it? But I think more than ever, and then I'm going to shut up on this one, but I feel so strongly, associations are, in a way, a gatekeeper of integrity for information and education. So even though others are doing it and cutting in, at low cost, they're not always doing education with the same level of integrity. It's like Wikipedia back in the day, right? We couldn't use it as a source like when I was in college, that because it wasn't always good information. You still had to go to the library and quote from a book or a published article, peer reviewed. That's how I look at associations. I don't think they should back out, but we do have to respond to the market. We don't live in a bubble. So yeah.
Well, and as you can imagine, that's our response too. Is not only is there an opportunity, there's a responsibility, I think, on the part of associations to be those educators with integrity in their marketplaces. I want to come back to what you said about potentially bundling education and membership. But before we get there, your comments raised a couple of other questions for me. One is around that question of integrity, and along with it, trust, credibility, authority, all the things that an association wants to represent in their marketplace. How much does your work with associations intersect with that? I mean, you talked about value before, and part of the value perception of an association is going to be, are they seen as having that integrity, having that trust, having that authority? How does that factor into your work? What are you seeing associations do to try to bolster that when they need to?
Yeah, a lot of it, I think that the maturity for that value prop is low. The only strong thing that I see right now is really saying something to the effect of like, we are the authority, gold standard, something like that. And that's a good starting place. I'm not knocking that. There's also what I see from clients is a lack of willingness to kind of go there competitively and make a clear statement. I had one local bar that was like, we know the state bar is not like doing this, even association to association. And they didn't want to say like, oh, we're including, this as well. And they don't. But I'm like, there could be a way to say, we're the only, local to the state or area or tri-state area that offers this without saying they don't, right? I think associations, we've always been a little bit afraid to act like a business, but we have to. Otherwise, we're not going to exists, period. So I think that we need to get a little bit more emboldened. I think there's a way to do it without disrespecting or comparing, but making statements of who we are. But yeah, I think that's important. And I think at some point that will also go away. I think value props change over years and decades. But right now, I think leaning into being a peer reviewed, having an ethics, a body of ethics, a body of work that's over decades, right? Like that is some of the value is I can go to associations I'm a member of and search historically, archives from the last 30 years. It's not just right now, quick, hot content that's getting pushed out. I can look and see trends and benchmark, and there's value in that. So I think capturing those stories is important. But the last thing I'll say on that one is that comes a lot into, with value props, there's two types. There's quantitative and there's qualitative. That's more of the qualitative. The quantitative is how many articles or how much, what's the depository look like? But the qualitative is, I know I can go to this association, and when my boss has a question on my area of expertise, I can find the answer and it's the right answer. That's right? Like that's the story we need to tell, not just we're the best or we are the standard, but telling those stories of we're the trusted source and here's what that looks like. Here's a story of us being the trusted source over and over again. That's way better than going to Claude or ChatGPT or a for-profit partner who we love, but is maybe just pumping stuff out as a marketing thing, not an education. Like they're not looking at outcomes. They're looking at lead generation. And that is different.
Right. Yeah, we've gotten increasingly focused on how do you tie your education back into that trust, that credibility, that authority, because that stands you out in the marketplace if your education is seen as really deeply tied to that.
Running a learning business today requires attention to growing reach, generating revenue, and demonstrating real impact, all while navigating constant change and fierce competition for learners' time and money.
To help, we've curated a collection of free resources for learning business professionals. You'll find frameworks, briefings, and reports, webinars, and tools focused on strategy, portfolio design, pricing, marketing, and more, all created specifically for organizations that sell continuing education and professional development.
If you care about building a stronger, more sustainable learning business, visit leadinglearning.com/free resources.
That's leadinglearning.com/free resources for practical tools and strategic insight to help you grow your reach, revenue, and impact. You'd mentioned that education is often what's profitable in the association's portfolios when you look at it. Something we found, and I'm wondering if you find this too, is in many cases, organizations don't actually have a good understanding of their education's profitability because they don't know the whole underlying cost structure, like staff may not be accounted for properly across products and that sort of thing. So there's an exercise to go through around what is the profitability here? What might it be if we really look at the data and get at what is possible here? How much are you seeing that kind of thing?
I'm seeing that quite a bit, and also deeper conversations, like getting a bit more technical in a good way, such as looking at the cost of subject matter experts, like these one-time high costs, if it's something deeper like a course, right? Or, not just a quick learning. What are the costs of that, but then spread out over the years and recouping and all that. So that's something I'm seeing as well. The other interesting thing, this goes more into the comparative against the competitive landscape that's moved beyond just associations, which is the cost to serve, I think, for like a for-profit is way cheaper because they've got in-house SMEs, they've got in-house production, video, all that. So for them, there is a cost, but they've already got a setup in a way, and it's a bit quicker. I think one thing for me that I would almost encourage associations to think through is instructional design 1,000,000% matters. I think back to doing my doctorate, one of the phrases that we used a lot in the dissertation phase is done is better than perfect. I think some are also like, oh, we have to be flashy, like we need, and I know we don't want talking heads with a deck, right? But I think sometimes we get so focused on the glamorization of education. And it's like, listen, is it right? And is it current? And are we keeping it updated? I think to me, that matters a little bit more in outcomes. Maybe I'm a direct person, maybe, right? I'm not saying it doesn't matter at all, but I think we could also focus a little bit more on again, it goes back to like integrity of the product. I think that matters a lot more than trying to do too much too quick. We almost have to be agile because education, there's always new I mean, we've been through a global pandemic, recession, like so much just in the last few years. We're always having to pump out information. So let's get it out in a good, clean way, write information that they trust, get them sticky with us to trust us to keep doing that and keep it moving. The shelf life is not going to be 10 years. So let's keep it moving a little bit. But that's the long answer, that's my 2 cents.
We agree. I mean, I think we continually see organizations kind of get themselves wrapped around the wheel a little bit too much around design and bells and whistles and things like that. And you're right. I mean, you don't want just a talking head with a deck, but the fact is, even a talking head with a deck can be done a lot better. There are good versions of that. You'd mentioned it, and we'd actually had some email about this beforehand. I definitely wanted to make sure we focus in some on it in this conversation. Is this idea of potentially rolling education, particularly digital education? It can be a little more complicated with face-to-face, though I have seen it done. Rolling digital education into membership, potentially to justify or to bolster membership value, and or potentially creating what you've called an education pass. And I've heard organizations call it that, where it's a bundle or it's your subscription that you're going to, upsell to your members or sell it to non-members if that is in fact a part of membership. So can you talk a little bit more about what you're seeing there? What's driving those kinds of decisions for organizations you're working with?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've seen it done many ways. We've literally done this at least 5 to 10 times in the last year or two with clients, probably 10 times in the last 2 years easily. And it all looks different. Every time it's a slightly different outcome. So some of them are saying, okay, we're going to pick certain digital education, not everything. So it might be quicker things like our things that are under an hour. But if it's a session, that's not included, or in person, not included. Some of them are rolling that into membership and then upping the cost. And they're doing what I call the peanut butter spread, where, let's say 10% of members were taking that education and average spend was only $100 across each of them. Well, if we up membership by $10 and give it to everyone, it's the same profitability, right? And that's kind of a no-brainer for members. And usually we can raise it by $20 and now we've doubled revenue and probably quadrupled profitability, and it's still a win-win to members. So that's a way, but in that case, we're looking holistically at education and membership. Other times I've seen it, one client, the one that was competing with the state, they included digital plus any in-person that was up to 3 credits, meaning more like a lunch and learn, but not a full day, more like quarterly little things. They included those as well because it made sense, but for others it doesn't. And then for other orgs, we've done it as an upsell, either sometimes to members, sometimes non-members only, sometimes both, where we might say, again, we pick what's included. It's usually not everything, but it's a good chunk, maybe some basics. And we say, okay, when you renew your membership for an extra $99, you can buy and you get access for the year. With others, maybe it's already included in membership, but for non-members, it's a way to get that annual recurring revenue through a subscription model without them becoming members. Maybe they don't want to spend $500 a year on membership, but they'll spend $100 or $150 a year, or even for ancillary. We've done this with medical organizations as well, where maybe for a physician organization, for example, maybe for PAs, nurse practitioners, they can't be members according to the bylaws. They're already buying a la carte CMEs, but now we create this bundle where they get access to some basics to help them in practice. So we've done it a lot of ways. It works well. One of the big things I want to make sure I say, though, is operationally, you still need to line item those wins for education. And this is something we talked about a little bit in our exchange email. I don't think that means that the portfolio gets absorbed into membership because then all of a sudden it's like, well, membership's doing great, but education doesn't really have revenue. Why do we have an education staff? And it's like, because the bolstering revenue is because of them, not because of membership. So it's important to figure out, and that it can look a few different ways, but to figure out, okay, education is still a standalone department, and usually they still have a lot of products to sell and in person to do and all that. But knowing, okay, this percentage of membership is allocated back to education's win and to that staff. So when you're doing KPIs and metrics and evaluations, you're not getting lost. And then 5 years later, someone feels like, well, we can cut the education staff. And it's like, no, you can't. Like, This is the other thing I'll say too, real fast. There is products change, and it's like an accordion. Some, for a few years you might bundle, then you might debundle or come up with new premium education offerings. So again, there can still be non-dues revenue. It's not always the right answer for everyone, but for a lot of organizations, sometimes it's been really successful because, again, what I mostly see is them coming to associations for education, not membership. Events if they can go, but there's so much budget restrictions, all that. So digital education is kind of the win-win right now for associations. And I think it will be for this decade, for some years to come still. But yeah. So that's kind of some of the things we're doing. I don't know, are y'all seeing that or is it still more a la carte? I'm curious, not to flip it back on you, but I'm curious to hear what you guys are seeing as experts as well in the space. Are you seeing anything with that or thought? What are your thoughts?
Oh, yeah. I think, we talk about this constantly. I mean, not that a la carte can't be viable anymore, but it's a much harder game, so to speak, to do things purely a la carte. And we're seeing much more, whether it's subscriptions, particularly in that sort of business to consumer model. If you're selling to individual members, subscriptions can work very well. We've seen, for example, American Speech Language Hearing Association, Jack Corson has come on and talked about that at our events and on the podcast before, though he's even taking that now into the business to business model, and like health systems are buying that sort of thing. And then we're seeing in that sort of business to business model, David Upton from the Mortgage Bankers Association spoke at one of our recent events, and they package their education up into bundles. I think they call it Education Advantage, if I'm remembering the name of his program, and like it's tiered. And I want to ask you about this too, like sort of how you approach the pricing. But tier one is just digital. Tier two is actually tier one is just on demand digital. Tier two is on demand plus live digital. And I think maybe at that point, they start to insert maybe one or two seminars, face-to-face seminars. Tier three gives more of the face-to-face. And then they have a custom level, for their big, and they're selling to banks. And they have this whole structure for how to price it. And a really compelling offer to the banks for why to buy into education in this way rather than on a more ad hoc model. So we're seeing a lot of success with that, definitely.
That's good. Yeah, because and that ties in because one other thing that I'm noticing, especially when we talk B2B, whether it's trade versus individual society, or if it's still some kind of organizational purchase, is with purse strings tightening, a lot of organizations it's getting harder to get ad hoc purchases approved. So you'll get membership approved, but then throughout the year, when you want to go to something outside of maybe one big conference, it's hard. So when you bundle it and you can sell it at the same time at one touch point a year, they can more easily budget, buy it, set and forget. So it's also helping, I think, with like customer experience. It's making it easier on the member, but it's also, again, helping to get more revenue in.
I'm wondering what you see as potential dangers or areas where organizations have to be cautious about this. You already raised one around making sure that the role of education isn't discounted in this whole process, that there needs to be accounting for what education is contributing to the overall business model for the organization. So I worry about the potential erosion of pricing power with more ad hoc offerings. If you got all this stuff packaged up in a subscription, that people can get access to, and they're not necessarily sort of equating the price with the content they're getting, but you still want to sell some ad hoc stuff. Does that have a downward pressure on that? Is this just, how do you communicate effectively to members and customers to make sure they're actually seeing the value of what they're getting in these different sort of packages and pricing scenarios?
Yeah, this is where I think the accordion mindset comes in. So it can cannibalize, yes, but I don't think it's as easy to cannibalize as some people think. I will say there was one scenario with a client 2 years ago where we tested this, and the answer was no, stay a la carte. So that was one, though, out of 40, 50 projects in the last 2 years. And probably a third of them looked at this type of model. So again, it's rare, but there can be cases. But here's the thing. I would say because associations only have so much money and research in the business area, look to for-profit. For-profit is moving to subscription models and more one-time, one and done. Even I'm looking at buying a new car right now. I was looking at the 2027 Highlander, and I noticed that they have, which I've written off my list now because I don't like the third row, but I've noticed that they have a subscription model for so much of the tech in the car. Even, car dealerships tried with prepay for your oil changes and, all your service for the first 3 years. A lot of organizations are moving to that model, which means that in general, across the landscape, we as human beings are being conditioned to subscribe either at smaller incremental amounts or once a year, right? I pay for my car insurance twice a year. I don't do monthly. I just like to know it's done. We're getting conditioned to that in the world, not just in the association space. And again, those ad hoc are, we're much pickier and that with ad hoc purchases. So I think, could it cannibalize? It could, if you never create anything beyond that. If you put everything in and then that's it, and you leave it that way for 20 years, then yeah, like you probably have screwed up. The way that you don't is by, number one, defining clearly what is included, because it's usually not all of your education, it's some of it. So you make a name for that, you bundle that in. You still sell non-dues pieces, but maybe now it's more premium. Then maybe after 3 years, you do start to introduce some lower, here's a 3-hour whatever, how to prompt engineer better. I'm sure in 3 years, AI, it'll be a different topic, but, and then maybe that's a lower cost, like it's a $100 or $300, online thing. You still sell other things, but we're trying to bolster. It's kind of like we're lifting the legs of the table, and there's education, there's membership, there's events, there's sponsorship, there's publications, there's all these legs. We're trying to bolster all of them and lift the financial viability of the organization. And I think right now, the easiest lever is working with education in some way. That, to me, membership's only going to go up so much in price. Events are only going to go up so much in price. Again, margins are slim on all those. Publications, forget it. Events, forget it. Education, digital education is where we can really pull some levers and get the lift that we need while serving our members well. They want that from us. So how do we do that? That's where the strategy comes in, and the answer is not one size fits all. But I think the only way that you cannibalize is if you're also the type of organization that doesn't raise membership dues for 20 years. If you're asking this question, it's kind of like parenting, right? Like those of us that are like, am I being a good parent? Like therapists will say, if you're asking that question, you're probably a good parent. It's the same thing. If you're asking, how do we not cannibalize? You're probably not going to let it cannibalize. It's if your head in the sand. I think they'll be okay, but still offer non-dues education products. I'm not saying don't. I'm saying it might be a way, whether it's subscription, a la carte, outside of membership, embedding in, or whatever that looks like. Even in upselling events, it might not be membership. It might be come to the event, and then there's an upsell pass for the digital, and then you get to see the breakouts that you missed when there's concurrent sessions. And that's a way to do a subscription and think about it. And then sell it for a higher price to those that didn't even come to the conference, right? There's many ways you can slice the pie. So
I think you kind of referenced all the different types of products and opportunities, that an association might represent. And something that's become more and more part of our work lately is looking at governance around education product decisions. Because, in associations, a lot of times it's like dispersed out through different committees. There's no coordination. There's a significant governance issue at many organizations. Part of that discussion, though, is pricing. Who should own pricing decisions in an organization, particularly when education is there with a bunch of other products that are in the organization's portfolio? So who makes those decisions? And a related question I'll go ahead and ask is, when should those decisions be made? Because a lot of times we see an organization build a product and then they're like, how should we price it?
Yep. Okay. I love you for these two questions. Okay. I'm going to answer the second one first because it's quicker,
Sure.
Then I'll go to the first. For when you should decide on pricing, the best way to do that, best practice is to actually test pricing when you're at the conception stage before you've built the product. Because think about, again, any other business, if as a consultant, if I said, I'm going to consult on pricing for associations, but then I find out that the associations are only willing to give us $1,000, but expect a 6-month engagement, that's not financially feasible. So it's not a business. So you should, to a degree, be testing new products before you build them, with education, with anything. But education is the main area where this exists, because that's where we're kind of pumping new products right now. So you should be testing with concept in advance. If you do it after, I've had clients do this. They've built a product, hired us to price it, and I'm like, I have a gut feeling here. And they're like, no, just see what they say. And then it's like, they don't even like one client, I won't name names, but one client it just built it in the wrong platform. Like their users, they built it as a Word doc plugin. And then their users were like, we don't have Office enabled devices. We use PDF. So we would like it if it were a PDF extension, but this we would never buy. The willingness to pay is zero. And I kind of told them that. And then when that happened, they were sitting in on the focus groups and I'm like, okay, so before you build the product, you should price. The other thing, though, as far as governance, decision making. So I think, listen, I kind of don't care who it sits with because associations are all nimble and different and have different organizational setups. I do think that there should be, though, to me, best practices, a pricing governance committee where it's department heads. And especially with education, to your point, Jeff, because education is, sometimes there'll be the digital education, team that works with SMEs and all that. Then there's the events, which is still education. Then there's like in-person workshop. I've worked with that with like medical orgs where they've got, and there's a triangulation that's happening. And they're like, well, we can't charge this because they're only charging this. I'm like, we got to get on the same page. The customer doesn't give a damn what your departments are. They're buying products from the organization, right? You've got to be cohesive here, right? So I think the leaders of departments should be meeting, talking. We actually have a governance template for free in our book. You can get it for free on the website or whatever. It's on Amazon, all that crap. But there is at the end a governance template. Or if anyone wants to message me, I'll send them the Google Doc of it for free. But it basically outlines these decisions where every year the committee should meet and discuss what are our plans for the next year, who's going up in price, all that. It should be data backed. You should be looking at data and value and pricing. And you're not making big changes every year. Like usually it's a cost of living-ish, but every 3 to 5 years, there might be that accordion. Like, okay, it's time for membership, or it's time for events, or it's time for sponsorship to do an accordion stretch or tie back in. And we're going to repackage a little bit, adjust pricing, more substantially, test some new things out. But you don't do it all in 1 year across everything, or you're going to give whiplash. So, 1 year might be membership, the next year might be sponsorship, the next year might be events, the next year might be digital education, whatever. And you kind of cycle through, right? But every year you should be meeting and saying, here's what we're doing. How does that impact the customer journey, right? And how are we working together? Again, maybe education isn't rolled in, but maybe there is an upsell option direct on the membership renewal for a pass or whatever. How do we document? What's the process? How are we making this easy for people to say yes and spend money with us because we're the right solution? So that's my 2 cents. It shouldn't just sit with one person like a CFO. It should be the heads of products coming together and saying, here's what we want to do. Here's what you want to do. How do we all want to proceed? And the CEO should be, heavily involved in that CFO. But I think it should be more of an internal staffing committee wherever the bylaws don't require the board to vote, which is usually only membership if they do. Outside of that, usually staff is empowered to make all pricing decisions.
So one last thing I'll ask about here, and I'll start with the observation that pricing is a very dynamic field. I think people who don't deal with it a lot maybe think, well, it's just some set of rules I need to follow and that sort of thing. But no, it's very, particularly with AI coming along, it's really thrown a huge wrinkle into pricing. So I'm wondering, for you personally, there's a little bit of a double-barreled question though, because I want you personally, and then what you would recommend to others, like, how do you stay on top of how pricing is evolving? How do you educate yourself and keep learning? And for somebody who's listening who maybe does not understand pricing all that well and just wants to educate themselves as much as possible.
2 thought leaders that I really love personally are Ron Baker and Ed Kless. They are both accountants by trade, and they focus on value-based pricing for accountants, like as a service. And so same thing, instead of going from like hourly, going to project-based, value-based. I love them. I met them through getting the CPP, and they're literally great. They have simple examples, again, not specific to the association space, but just good general knowledge. Another book that I love is called Value as a Service. I've read many pricing books. I have over 800 books, and at least 10 or 20 are pricing. So in my library, so there's a lot, but that's a good one as well. The other thing that I would say is there's another one, I can't remember the exact name. So I'll find it and I'll send it to you for the show notes, but it's something like 10 Pricing Psychology Hacks or Pricing Psychology. And that's another good one. I think most of pricing, it's not math. People can think, oh, it's just the number. I would say 80% of pricing is psychology and marketing. And then like 20% is finance. It's what will you pay, but it's what will you pay based on? Like there's the reason I pay $8 for a Starbucks coffee is because it makes me feel a certain way. It's the qualitative value and the quantitative. But I can buy a coffee for $2 at the gas station or $1. What's the difference? I don't give a damn about the beans and you know what I mean? I care about, I feel some kind of way, status symbol holding a Starbucks coffee cup, right? And you're a part of a club in a way. So that's where being a member, being a part of a community, like it's the psychology. So my best advice is study psychology on consumer behavior, decision-making, behavioral economics. Florian Bauer is really good at that as well, behavioral economics. He's over in Europe. I know him as well. Fantastic guy, super smart. And so, yeah, those are some people, some books, some resources that I love, that I follow, that I learn from. Otherwise, I like to read anything on pricing on LinkedIn, honestly, like when Wendy's was doing the dynamic, thing with their boards. And I like kind of seeing those B2B and B2C examples and then figuring out how does that play into associations. So I look at it more like I'm a translator.
That wraps up our conversation with Dr. Michael Carr-Tatonetti, founder and CEO of Pricing for Associations. But stay with us another minute to catch our recap.
You'll find show notes and a transcript for this episode at leadinglearning.com/episode 475, along with links to Michael's profile on LinkedIn and to the Pricing for Associations website. There, you can get a free copy of his book, Pricing for Associations, as well as access to hundreds of articles on pricing.
If you found this episode valuable, we'd be grateful if you'd share it. That helps more people find the show and benefit from the conversation, and it supports the work we do.
So in our conversation, Michael emphasized that effective pricing starts with understanding value, looking at data on engagement, purchasing behavior, and customer perceptions to guide decisions.
He also talked about the growing shift toward bundling and subscription-style models for education and how those approaches can strengthen both the customer experience and the financial sustainability of the organization.
At the same time, organizations need to be thoughtful about governance and timing, testing pricing concepts before building new products, and making sure education's role in overall revenue remains visible.
Lots to think about if you're responsible for pricing, packaging, or positioning learning products in your organization.
Thanks again for listening, and see you next time on the Leading Learning Podcast.